There's a problem with our maps, and I'm going to show you what I mean. These kinds of maps might be familiar to you. Clean lines, easy to read national states, and you can clearly see the borders. And for our times, these kinds of maps might seem sufficient. Along a border, for example between Austria and Slovenia, you will see signs telling you that you are leaving one country and entering another. Sometimes there's even a chance that you will be stopped by authorities and asked to show your ID. With that ID, the police can connect you to a specific political system, where you pay taxes, where you're registered in the social system, and they often can make an educated guess on the language you are speaking and the culture you are participating in. Our understanding of personal identity is deeply shaped by these lines on a map. The solidification of borders and national states is a product of nation building in the modern period. And so maps produced in the modern period often look like this. But not only maps of modern states. Even maps of territories from ancient times are often drawn in the same way. Yet the historical reality was very different. Last month, our research project held a major conference that addressed exactly this problem. Imperial Dynamics, Borderlands and Resistance was its title, and I had the opportunity to interview one of the speakers about a topic I previously knew nothing about.
We will have heard about Alexander the Great, Augustus, Cleopatra, but beyond that, the worlds to the east are largely out of easy connection. They're not really taught at schools.
This is Professor Dr. Robin Coningham, one of the leading archaeologists from Durham University.
My world that I work on is called the early historic period of South Asia. So I use the term South Asia that some people find a little confusing. They might use a broad term like India. But actually I use the term South Asia because I work with colleagues in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, also in Sri Lanka. So South Asia is a broader perspective. Some people might call it ancient India. Period I'm interested in is from about 1000 before the Common Era until about 500 of the Common Era. Because for me, this is a critical time. It's a time when cities emerge. It's a time where kingdoms, coinage, scripts arrive, and also it's a fascinating time because it's a time when a number of powerful teachers start teaching about renunciation, giving up wealth, non-violence, like the Buddha or the founder, one of the prophets of the Jains, Mahavira. So it's a really interesting time and a huge time of change.
One of the major topics he studies is the Mauryan Empire. The now widely heroized founder of this empire is Chandragupta Maurya. The empire existed roughly from 320 BC to 185 BC, and its neighbors are familiar even to a European audience.
I've been talking about the Mauryan Emperor. The Mauryan Emperor, which we know from their inscriptions in India, they very clearly are contemporaries and neighbors of Hellenistic kings. So we know they're in direct control. But actually, their empires look different, and we try to make them fit into either a colonial British model of an empire or into perhaps a Greek or Hellenistic model of an empire. And they're not. They're far more flexible and far more debatable and also far more understudied.
So when Europeans studied the Mauryan Empire in the modern period, they often projected their own ideas of empire and borders onto South Asia. One reason for this may be the strong influence of Hellenistic sources on early research. The Greek diplomat Megasthenes, for instance, visited Chandragupta Maurya in Pataliputra. And he writes that Chandragupta was the owner of everything and maintained control over his empire through spies and guards. That sounds like a rigid, pyramidal power structure. This perspective might make some sense for the capital city, but for the whole empire?
We tend to think of social control, particularly empires, as being like a pyramid, a hierarchy, with a ruler, an emperor, a king, and then the royal family, a group of nobles, administrators, and at the bottom supporting everyone through surplus and labour, the working classes. What I'm interested in is that's a very simplistic model. So it suggests and it projects a single set of authority. In the worlds that I work in South Asia, we've got evidence that, yes, there is a sort of civic authority which may have this sort of pyramid, but at the same time, there are religious hierarchies which are equally significant, influential, but they are not necessarily exhibiting or using the same vehicles of power. So, for example, Buddhist temples appear to be places which attract donations. They come to own land. They become almost a second pillar, perhaps not particularly unlike the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. That sort of relationship where you begin to get temporal power, but also divine authority on earth. And those are the challenges. And it's complex within Europe. It's also complex within South Asia, particularly because probably you have multiples of these. It's just archaeologically, we're very poor at picking these up in a very elitist or kingly set of readings.
What makes it so difficult to see beyond this model is the dominance of what Professor Coningham calls kingly readings. These are sources such as Magastinus reports or the heavy reliance on royal inscriptions. They make it difficult to recognize alternative forms of organization, heterarchies instead of hierarchies. Temples and monasteries, for example, they seem to have existed largely outside the direct authority of the king.
So, for example, where I've been working in Sri Lanka, in the city of Anuradhapura, it's one of the biggest mercantile religious centers in the early medieval period in the Indian Ocean. Its city measures about 0.5 kilometre by 0.5 kilometre. It's surrounded by 24 square kilometres of monasteries. So they're arranged into 3 or 4 very major sects who have smaller monasteries across the landscape. And you could very sensibly argue that kingly power is hugely restricted because over the centuries, more and more land, more and more water, which for Sri Lanka, you need water for irrigation, for cultivation. Actually, that's been given to the monasteries, and the monasteries are issued with immunities, which means you cannot tax them. The king's officers cannot actually enter them. And also, none of the labor that's there needs to work on royal activities. So it's a way of maybe pacifying the edges of an uncertain empire, of creating borders, but at the same time it builds in an instability because there is no direct royal control of it. It's almost a sort of domestication of that periphery.
So, if I asked you now to draw the borders of the Mauryan Empire, would you include the monasteries? If the king had almost zero authority there, does it really make sense to color them as part of the empire? They seem almost completely disconnected. On the other hand, the Mauryan army could theoretically take control of labor, water and taxes by force, so these monasteries were clearly within the intervention radius of the empire. But if we think in terms of intervention radius, then what about the parts of Greek territories in the west? You see the problem. These clean, solid maps do not represent the complex historical reality, and they never did, and they never will. Professor Coningham refers to them as ink-blot empires.
I was taught as an undergraduate with a series of maps and, all slide film. And each map, you had a map of the Mauryan Empire, you had a map of the Persian Empire, you had a map of Alexander's empire. And all of these had really solid edges to them, and they were coloured. And then for, say, up to the 1900s, you had colonial empires of Europe. And across the world, there were For example, for the British, it was a pink map. And that is what I would call an ink blot empire. The term was, the first time I came up with the term was Monica Smith from UCL was using this term ink blot empire. And it gives a solidity and a set of boundaries which never existed. So that's why I find it so interesting when you start looking at it and beginning to imagine, for a start, running an empire is expensive. How can you possibly gather enough revenue to pay for a highly hierarchical empire? And you will have ebbs and flows of empire. And so looking at it as an ink blot is really unhelpful, and it tends to suppress any form of discourse agency within it.
The concept we need instead is that of imperial borderlands. These are regions that lie within the empire's intervention radius, but are, for various reasons, only loosely connected to the central authority. And this creates some fascinating dynamics.
The Mauryans are a great example because you look at where edicts are.
With edicts, Professor Coningham means monuments whose inscriptions announce new laws or imperial decrees.
You draw a line around the outside and then you colour everything inside. And it's a fantasy. And even the edicts suggest that there are different things happening, because in the areas where we find them in Afghanistan, they're written in Greek script, in a Greek language. But exactly the same message is being given in, say, what's northern Pakistan today. You find these boulders and they're carved with, again, exactly the same text, but they're written in Kharosthi script in the Aramaic language. And then in areas of Nepal and India today, they're written in a Brahmi script, but a traditional Prakrit language. So the same messages are being given to what are clearly a very cosmopolitan, diverse community. And that's really exciting. But if you look at where the actual edicts are, they don't cover the whole of that interior ink blot. So it suggests there are certain areas which are very powerfully linked to the center, but then there are areas which perhaps through either resistance or through lack of resource are less significant to the empire.
So now imagine again going on a road trip along the western border of the Mauryan Empire, and you are stopped by the authorities. What would be the chances that they could accurately guess which political system you pay taxes to, what language you speak, or what culture you belong to? If inkblot empires were real, this might be easy, but in reality, empires were never solid political bodies, and they were especially fluid in their borderlands, even when our textual sources claim otherwise.
Inscriptions often are propagandist in the past. They project a particular perspective, a kingly reading. I'm an archaeologist. I deal with broken sherds. For me, comparing the kingly reading with a utilitarian or maybe artifactual reading helps us estimate somewhere in the middle is truth, if there is such a thing.
Thank you for joining us on this short journey into the conceptualization of the Mauryan Empire. If you are interested in the newest research from our project, subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram and wherever you like to stay connected.